Betrayed and publicly humiliated by her husband, she disappears without a trace. Years later, she returns a multimillionaire and executes a revenge so devastating that he falls to his knees begging for forgiveness. His bitter regret reveals a secret that changes everything. Before you watch, like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are from so we can deliver even more videos to you. The Magnolia Hotel glittered like a jewel in the starry night, its golden lights reflecting on the polished windows and the gleaming marble of the lobby. To any observer, it was just another high society party, crystal glasses clinking, polite laughter echoing through the ornate halls, expensive perfumes mixing in the air. But for Teresa, that night would mark the beginning of a journey that would transform her soul forever. Standing before the large mirror in the ladies' restroom, Teresa nervously adjusted her navy blue dress. It was not a designer piece like the ones adorning the other guests, but it had been chosen with care, saving for months to look adequate beside her important husband. The pearls she wore around her neck were real, a gift for their 5th wedding anniversary, a time when Albert still seemed proud to have her as his wife. "Can you do this?" she whispered to herself, rehearsing a smile that did not reach her brown eyes. "It's just another party, but you already know when something is deeply wrong, don't you? That unsettling feeling that settles at the bottom of your stomach, like a weight that cannot be ignored." Teresa had been feeling this for months, in the secret phone calls Albert received, and would step away to answer, in the feminine perfume, different from hers, that sometimes lingered on his shirts on nights when he arrived home too late, with increasingly unconvincing excuses. Returning to the main hall, her eyes instinctively searched for Albert. He was near the stage, talking animatedly with his partner, Ronald. The two men formed a successful duo in the civil construction business. Albert, with his natural charm that won over clients. Ronald, with his calculating mind for business. Beside them, laughing at something Ronald said, was Monica, the new executive secretary of the company, stunning in her red dress, which left little to the imagination. Have you ever felt that moment when the world seems to slow down? When every detail becomes painfully clear, as if your senses were amplified to capture the impending catastrophe? That's how Teresa saw the look that Albert cast at Monica. It was not the look of a boss at his employee. It was the same look that years ago he had directed at her. "Is everything okay, dear?" The voice of one of the executive's wives brought her back to reality. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine," Teresa replied automatically, the social smile returning to her face like a well-rehearsed mask. "Just a little tired." The music dimmed, and the master of ceremonies announced that it was time for the host's speech. The lights focused on the small stage set up in the center of the hall. Albert walked confidently to the microphone, but not alone. Monica was by his side, their hands intertwined like lovers who no longer need to hide their affection. The silence that took over the hall was deafening. Dozens of eyes turned simultaneously to Teresa, some with thinly veiled pity, others with the morbid excitement of those watching a car accident in slow motion. "Good evening, everyone," Albert began, his amplified voice echoing through the hall. "Tonight is special for many reasons. Our company has reached record numbers this year, and we are about to start the biggest project in our history." Polite applause filled the room. Teresa remained motionless, her body frozen, while her mind screamed for her to run away. "But there is another reason to celebrate today," he continued, squeezing Monica's hand. "As some of you may have already realized, my personal life is undergoing significant transformations. Can you imagine the sound of someone's heart breaking? It's not like in movies or books. There's no dramatic crack or explosion of emotion. It's a deep silence, an emptiness that expands until it consumes everything around it. After much reflection, I realized that my marriage to Teresa has come to an end. She's a wonderful woman." He looked briefly in her direction, with what seemed to be a mix of pity and impatience. But she never truly understood my dreams, my ambitions. And in Monica, he smiled at the young woman beside him, I found not only an exceptional business partner, but the true love of my life. The murmur that followed was like waves crashing against rocks, growing, uncontrollable, deafening. Teresa felt the ground sway under her feet. The betrayal itself was not a surprise. Deep down, she already knew. But the public humiliation, the spectacle of her marital failure transformed into entertainment for the city's elite. She could never have imagined that. Ms. Clelia, her mother-in-law, watched the scene from a distance with a discreet smile of satisfaction. The family matriarch had never hidden her displeasure with her son's choice. Teresa was too simple, without the social pedigree or sophistication that the family expected. Now, her look clearly said, I always knew this would happen. In the midst of the chaos of emotions, Teresa felt a gentle hand on her arm. It was Teresa, for years her housekeeper, and in moments like this, her only true ally in that world of appearances. Let's get out of here, Mrs. Teresa, whispered the older woman, her face marked by wrinkles of genuine concern. But Teresa couldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Albert and Monica, who were now receiving congratulations as if they were announcing an engagement and not the destruction of a 7-year marriage. It was Ronald who broke the trance, approaching with a glass of champagne as if nothing had happened. Teresa, dear, he said with false cordiality, these things happen in the best of families. I'm sure you can resolve this civilly. The hypocrisy in his voice was what finally brought Teresa back to reality. She looked at Ronald, seeing for the first time the malice disguised behind the friendly smile. He had always been there, feeding Albert's ambitions, pushing him away from her with promises of grandeur and power. Thank you for your concern, Ronald, she replied, her voice surprisingly firm. But I think you've already done enough for our family. Without waiting for a response, Teresa turned and walked towards the exit. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, curious glances following her every step. Some pretended not to see, continuing their conversations in a low voice. Others watched openly, feeding on the drama that broke the monotony of their privileged lives. The rain began to fall when Teresa left the hotel, heavy drops that mixed with the tears she finally allowed herself to shed. Without a car, they had arrived together in Albert's, and not wanting to call a taxi where everyone could see her, she simply started walking. The wet streets reflected the city lights like broken mirrors, fragments of a distorted reality. The blue dress, chosen with so much care, was now soaked, clinging to her body like a second skin. Her hair, once meticulously styled, fell in heavy strands around her face. Have you ever felt that sense of unreality that accompanies moments of crisis? As if you were watching a movie about your own life, unable to believe that this is really happening to you. When Teresa finally got home, it was still her home, at least for that night. She found her suitcases already packed by the front door. The message could not be clearer. Her presence was no longer welcome. Her expulsion had been planned long before that night's spectacle. Ms. Clelia was in the living room, her face a mask of false concern. "Ah, you're here," she said, as if Teresa were an unwanted visitor and not the daughter-in-law who had lived there for years. "I thought it was better to get things moving, you understand, don't you? It's better for everyone that this is resolved quickly and without scandals." Behind her, 2 men in suits waited, security guards hired to ensure the transition went smoothly. "Where are my things?" Teresa asked. Her voice just a whisper. "Everything that's yours is in the suitcases," her mother-in-law replied with a dismissive gesture. "The furniture, the jewelry, all that belongs to the family, naturally. The jewelry was gifts given by my son with family money," Ms. Clelia cut in. "Frankly, Teresa, you didn't really expect to take any of that. Be reasonable." In that moment, something changed inside Teresa. The pain was still there, overwhelming and brutal. But next to it, something new was born. A spark of anger, a seed of determination. "Where is Teresa?" she asked, looking for the only person who could offer her some comfort at that moment. Dismissed for today, we thought it was better that way. With trembling hands, Teresa took only one of the suitcases, the smallest one, ironically, knowing instinctively that it would contain her most personal belongings. The rest, as Ms. Clelia had made clear, no longer belonged to her. Before leaving, however, she did something that surprised even herself. She approached her mother-in-law, who instinctively recoiled as if she feared being assaulted. "One day," Teresa said, her voice low but clear, "you will remember this night, and you will regret it." It was not a threat, it was a promise. The rain continued to fall when Teresa left the mansion that had been her home. With only one suitcase and the money she kept hidden in a personal account, a habit that Albert had always ridiculed as poor people's paranoia, she disappeared into the night. What no one knew, not even Albert or his merciless mother, was that that night did not mark the end of Teresa's story. It was just the first chapter, because even on the darkest nights, when the rain seems endless, and every step is an exercise in sheer willpower, there is a truth that sustains those who have been deeply wounded. Sometimes, we need to lose everything to discover who we really are. And Teresa was about to discover a strength within herself that she never imagined she possessed. The dawn of a new beginning. Dawn arrived with a peculiar cruelty. Have you ever noticed how the sunlight can seem like an offense when your world collapsed the night before? For Teresa, the first rays that filtered through the fogged window of the interstate bus were like sharp knives, reminding her that, despite everything, the world kept turning with indifference to her suffering. Sitting in the back seat, with the only suitcase she had managed to save on the seat beside her, Teresa watched the landscape slowly transform. The city's skyscrapers gave way to open fields, which eventually gave way to the sight of the sea, vast, relentless, and somehow comforting in its constancy. She did not have a planned destination, just a ticket to the farthest point her money would allow. A small coastal town, one of those that are forgotten on tourist maps, inhabited mainly by fishermen and retirees seeking peace away from urban centers. "Next stop, Shell Harbor," the driver announced, his monotonous voice echoing through the almost empty bus. Teresa straightened up in her seat, her muscles protesting after hours of immobility. She had not slept. How could she? The images of the previous night repeated themselves like a horror movie in her mind. Monica's triumphant smile, Ms. Clelia's poorly disguised satisfaction, Albert's calculated indifference, and the looks, those looks of pity, amusement, and morbid curiosity that followed her to the hotel exit. The bus stopped with a jolt in front of a simple station, little more than a tiled roof over a worn wooden bench. Teresa got off, immediately greeted by the unmistakable smell of sea air and the distant sound of waves breaking on the beach. "First time here?" asked a man with skin tanned by the sun, who seemed to be the only other living soul in that forgotten station. Teresa nodded, unsure of how much she should reveal. "You'll like the place," he continued, pointing to a street that went down towards the sea. "If you're looking for a place to stay, Mrs. Zephyr rents rooms in that blue house down there. It's not luxury, but it's clean and honest." With a murmured thank you, Teresa followed the indicated direction. Her shoes, unsuitable for the uneven cobblestone streets, made her stumble occasionally. Yesterday, she was the wife of one of the most prominent businessmen in the big city. Today, she was just another anonymous outsider, carrying a suitcase and secrets too heavy for her delicate shoulders. The blue house was not difficult to find. It stood out among the simple buildings on the street, not for its grandeur, but for the evident care in every detail. Colorful flowers adorned the small front garden, and the white wooden windows were all open, inviting the sea breeze inside. Mrs. Zifa was in the garden when Teresa approached. She was a short lady, with white hair tied in a loose bun, and hands that showed decades of hard work. She looked at the newcomer with the natural curiosity of someone who lives in small towns, but without the invasiveness common to gossips. "Good morning," Teresa greeted, her voice still weak after hours of not being used. "I heard you rent rooms." Mrs. Zifa's eyes, a surprisingly vivid blue for someone her age, studied Teresa for a moment. She saw the small suitcase, the clothes too fine for that place, the puffy eyes of someone who had cried all night, and the barely disguised desperation of someone with nowhere to go. "I have a room in the back," she replied, wiping her hands on her floral apron. "It's not much, but it has a view of the sea. I think it will do while you rest." The word rest hung in the air like an offer of truce. She did not ask why a woman clearly accustomed to comforts arrived alone, with only one suitcase, in a city where she probably knew no one. She did not ask how long she planned to stay. She just made space in her house and, in a way, in her life. The room was, as promised, simple but welcoming. A single bed with a firm mattress, a dark wooden dresser that must have witnessed decades of stories, and a window that framed the ocean like a living painting. "The bathroom is shared at the end of the hall," Mrs. Zifa explained. "Breakfast is served at 7, but if you need to leave early or sleep in late, just let me know." She paused, as if considering her next words. "Here we respect each other's space. Your stories are yours to tell, when and if you want." With that, she left Teresa alone with her thoughts and the vastness of the sea as the only witness to her silent tears. The first few days passed in a fog of pain and exhaustion. Teresa slept a lot, her body and mind seeking refuge in the temporary forgetfulness that only sleep could offer. When she was awake, she spent hours sitting on the small balcony, watching the hypnotic movement of the waves. It was during one of these contemplative afternoons that Mrs. Zifa joined her, bringing a tray with herbal tea and homemade biscuits. "When my August died," the old lady began without preamble, while pouring the tea into delicate cups, "I thought the world had ended. 42 years together, just imagine. One day he went out fishing and never came back." Teresa looked at her, surprised by both the story and the realization that this was the first time she had really paid attention to her hostess. How did you move on?" Her voice was hoarse from disuse. Mrs. Zifa smiled, a smile that carried both joy and melancholy. "I didn't. Not right away. First, I had to learn to stand still, to feel all the pain without running from it. It's like a big wave, you know? If you try to fight it, it drags you under. But if you dive into it, you eventually come out on the other side." The words hit Teresa with unexpected force. Since the night of the humiliation, she had been in constant motion, physical or mental, as if she could leave the pain behind if she just ran fast enough. "And then?" she asked, finally accepting the offered cup. "Then?" Mrs. Zifa continued, her hands never stopping the work even as they talked. "I discovered that my hands still knew how to create, even when my heart was broken. And that was enough salvation. That afternoon, something changed imperceptibly in the air between the two women. It was not yet friendship. Teresa's wound was too raw to allow any real intimacy, but it was a beginning, an opening, a small crack through which light could eventually enter. The phoenix rises. Have you ever had that moment when you realize you survived what you swore would destroy you? That instant of clarity when, amidst the pain that still lingers, you recognize that you are still breathing, still here, still able to feel something other than suffering. For Teresa, that moment came during the 3rd week in Shell Harbor. She woke up before dawn, restless after a dream she couldn't fully remember. Instead of forcing herself back to sleep, she got up and walked to the beach, still deserted at that hour. The sea was calm, almost placid, reflecting the first pink tones of the sky. Teresa took a deep breath, letting the salty air fill her lungs, and then, without warning, felt an overwhelming urge to go into the water. She didn't stop to think. If she had, maybe reason would have stopped her. She simply walked forward, letting the gentle waves wet her feet first, then her ankles, knees, waist. She kept walking until the water reached her neck, and only then did she stop. She floated there, suspended between sky and sea, feeling the salt on her skin like a baptism. The tears came, but this time, they were different. They were not just of pain, but also of relief, of acceptance, of understanding that no matter how deep the wound, time keeps moving, and with it comes the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility of healing. When she finally returned to the beach, the sun had already fully risen. Teresa sat on the sand, her hair dripping, her soaked clothes clinging to her body, and did something she hadn't done since the night of the party. She smiled, a small, hesitant, but genuine smile. It was with this new energy, still fragile, but undeniably present, that Teresa finally asked Mrs. Zeffa about the work she always saw in her hands. "This is bobbin lace," the old lady replied, showing the delicate pattern that emerged from the dance of the small wooden pieces between her experienced fingers. "I learned it from my grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother. It's getting lost, you know? Girls today don't have the patience for this kind of thing." "Could you teach me?" Teresa asked, surprising herself as much as her hostess. Mrs. Zeffa studied her for a moment, as if assessing whether the request was genuine or just courtesy. "Your hands are too delicate," she commented finally. "They'll get calluses." "Good," Teresa replied, looking at her pale palms that had never known physical labor. Maybe it's time for them to learn something new. And so began a new phase. In the mornings, Teresa helped Mrs. Zeffa with the boarding house chores, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, learning to cook simple but flavorful dishes. In the afternoons, they sat on the balcony, and Teresa received her first lessons in the art of lace. At first, her fingers were clumsy, unable to reproduce the fluid and precise movements of her mentor. The threads would get tangled, the patterns would come out crooked, and she would often end the day with small cuts and sore blisters on her once well-kept hands. "Patience," Mrs. Zeffa would advise whenever Teresa sighed in frustration. "You don't learn in a day what it took me decades to master." While Teresa slowly built a new routine by the sea, life continued in the big city she had left behind. Albert and Monica had made their relationship official with a discreet but elegant ceremony, the kind of event that would be on the cover of local society magazines. "The perfect couple," the photo captions read, showing the two smiling in their impeccable outfits. No one mentioned the abandoned ex-wife, as if Teresa had been not only expelled from the house and family, but also erased from the very narrative of their lives. Teresa, however, had not forgotten. The maid who had faithfully served the family for years kept secret contact with Teresa through sporadic calls from a public phone to the only cell phone at Mrs. Zeffa's boarding house. "Mrs. Teresa," she said in one of these conversations, her voice low even though no one could hear her. "Things are changing here. That Ronald, you know, is always whispering in your husband's ears, Mr. Albert's." "What kind of things?" Teresa asked, feeling a curiosity that surprised her. She thought she had left behind any interest in that life. "Strange business. Contracts that don't seem right. I heard him say the other day, 'Now that you've gotten rid of that meddling woman, we can do things my way.' As if you were an obstacle to his plans. Something in that information lit a spark in Teresa. It was not just the natural resentment for how she had been treated, but a deeper understanding that perhaps her presence in Albert's life had been more significant than he, or she herself, had ever realized. "Keep telling me everything, Teresa," she requested, before hanging up. It might be important. As the weeks turned into months, Teresa's hands gained strength and skill. The calluses, once painful, were now marks of silent pride. The lace she produced still didn't have the perfection of Mrs. Zepha's creations, but there was something different about it. An unexpected fusion between traditional technique and a modern sensibility that Teresa herself didn't know she possessed. "You have an eye for this," Mrs. Zepha commented one afternoon, observing a particularly intricate pattern that Teresa had developed. "You're not just copying, you're creating." It was during these long afternoons of manual work that Teresa began to rediscover parts of herself that had been silenced during the years of marriage. She remembered how she had always liked to draw, how she had dreamed of studying design before she met Albert and became absorbed in the role of the perfect wife. On nights when sleep refused to come, Teresa would take the fabric scraps that Mrs. Zepha would give her, mix different techniques, incorporate unusual materials, creating pieces that were not just traditional lace, but works that told stories, her stories. The first time someone was interested in buying one of her creations was almost by accident. A tourist staying at the boarding house saw a shawl that Teresa had made and insisted on taking it, offering an amount that left the novice artisan speechless. "That's more than I earn in a month helping Mrs. Zepha," she confided to her mentor after the tourist left. "It's a fair price," the old lady replied with simplicity. "What you do is art, girl, and art has its price." That first payment was like a confirmation, a sign that perhaps there was a way forward, not just a flight from the past, but a direction for the future. On a particularly warm afternoon, while they worked under the shade of the trees in the garden, Mrs. Zepha made a suggestion that would change everything. "Next weekend there's a craft fair in the central square. Why don't you take some of your pieces to sell?" Teresa hesitated. Until then, her new life had been contained within the safe limits of the boarding house, with the exception of occasional walks on the beach. The idea of exposing herself and her work to the outside world was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. "What if no one likes it? What if no one buys?" she asked, giving voice to the fears that haunted her. Mrs. Zepha laughed, a comforting sound, like the tinkling of bells in the wind. "What if they buy everything? What if your pieces are the most admired at the fair? You see, we can imagine 1,000 scenarios, but we'll only know the truth if we try." That's how, 6 months after her desperate escape, Teresa found herself setting up a small stall at the local fair. Her creations, shawls, scarves, details for clothes and accessories, were carefully arranged, each piece telling part of her emotional journey, although potential customers could not have known that. The response was beyond her most optimistic expectations. Not only did she sell almost everything she had brought, but she received enthusiastic praise and even orders for future pieces. Among the visitors was a woman who stood out for her discreet elegance and discerning eye. Yvonne, the owner of a boutique in a larger city nearby. "Your work is extraordinary," she said, carefully examining a lace scarf with golden threads. "I've never seen anything like it. It's traditional but also contemporary. Familiar, but surprising." Teresa thanked her, still uncomfortable with the compliments. Part of her was still that insecure woman who needed her husband's and mother-in-law's constant approval. "I have a proposal for you," Yvonne continued. "I would like to sell your pieces in my store. The commission would be fair, and I have clientele who would appreciate and pay well for this type of quality handmade work." The offer was tempting, but Teresa felt an inexplicable tightness in her chest. Selling her creations meant exposing herself to the world again. What if someone from her old life recognized her? What if the news reached Albert, Ms. Clelia? As if reading her thoughts, Yvonne added, "We don't need to use your real name if you prefer. Many artists work with pseudonyms." That night, back at the boarding house, Teresa shared the proposal with Mrs. Zepha. seeking advice from the wisdom of the older woman. "Fear is natural," the old lady said, her hands never stopping their work, even as they talked. "But don't let it define your limits. You ran away to survive. Now you need to decide if you just want to survive or if you want to live fully." The words echoed in Teresa's mind as she watched the sea through her bedroom window. The same sea that had witnessed her despair now reflected the full moon, a silver path over the dark waters, like a promise, an invitation to move forward. The next morning, Teresa called Yvonne and accepted the proposal. Not as Teresa, the humiliated and rejected ex-wife, but as Aurora, a name that carried with it the promise of a new dawn. Meanwhile, miles away, in his luxurious office, Albert looked worriedly at the numbers in front of him. The risky decisions Ronald had convinced him to make were beginning to show their first signs of trouble. Nothing serious yet, nothing that couldn't be overcome, but an unsettling omen of what was to come. "Maybe we should reconsider the Northern Region project," he suggested to his partner, who was distractedly flipping through a luxury car magazine. "Nonsense," Ronald replied with a confident smile. "Great rewards require great risks. You're getting soft, Albert. Is Monica's pregnancy making you too cautious?" The mention of the pregnancy, still in its early stages but already a reason for celebration among colleagues, made Albert smile automatically. A child, finally. Something Teresa had never been able to handle during all those years. Teresa. The name still caused an uncomfortable pang in his chest. Sometimes, in moments of sincerity with himself, he wondered where she was, how she was. But those moments were rare and quickly suppressed by the busy routine and Ronald's constant reminders of how he was better off without her. "Trust me," Ronald said, placing a heavy hand on his partner's shoulder. "By the end of the year, we'll be the biggest in the country, and it's all because you had the courage to make the right choices." Albert nodded, pushing away the momentary doubts. After all, Ronald had always been right so far, hadn't he? It was he who had suggested the expansion that had doubled profits the previous year. It was he who had introduced the investors, who allowed the opening of the branch in the capital. And it was he who, on that fateful night, had whispered in his ear, "She's holding you back, my friend. She's always been more loyal to her conscience than to you. If you want to really grow, you need to get rid of that weight." What Albert did not realize, as he signed another potentially disastrous contract, was that he was slowly losing control not only of his company, but of his own life. And while the empire he had built was imperceptibly beginning to crumble, the woman he had discarded as irrelevant was taking the first steps to build something entirely new. Not from the destruction caused by others, but from the strength she had discovered within herself. The final act. Time has a curious way of turning wounds into scars. Scars don't disappear. They remain with us, indelible marks of past battles. But unlike open wounds, they no longer bleed to the touch. That's how it was with Teresa, now known as Aurora, in the small but growing circle of admirers of her handcrafted work. A year had passed since that first fair, where Yvonne had discovered her talent. A year of hard work, of nights spent by candlelight perfecting techniques, creating original patterns, transforming tradition into innovation. A year in which her delicate hands, once adorned only with expensive rings, developed calluses that she displayed with silent pride. "We need to talk," Yvonne announced one autumn afternoon, appearing unexpectedly at Mrs. Zepha's boarding house. Her eyes shone with that characteristic intensity that always appeared when she had a new idea. Sitting on the balcony facing the sea, the two women shared a tea while the sea breeze gently rustled the palm leaves. "Your pieces are selling faster than I can restock," Yvonne continued, her enthusiasm almost palpable. "Last week, a client from Sao Paulo came especially to buy one of your shawls. Another one ordered 10 pieces to give as gifts at an international event." Teresa smiled. still not completely comfortable with the success. It was strange to think that her creations, born of pain and the need for rebuilding, were now objects of desire. What I'm trying to say, Yvonne placed her cup on the table with determination, is that we're no longer talking about local crafts. We're talking about a potential brand, something unique, with its own identity. And I want to propose a real partnership, not just a commercial relationship, but a partnership. I have the capital, the contacts, and business experience. You have the creative talent, the artistic vision, and a story that, even without being explicitly told, is conveyed through each piece you create. Have you ever felt that moment of absolute clarity, when the universe seems to align so perfectly that you can almost hear the pieces fitting together? For Teresa, it was as if all the difficulties of the last few months, the calluses, the tears, the doubts, suddenly made sense, revealing themselves as necessary steps on a ladder that was leading her up, not to the past. On one condition, she replied, a new firmness in her voice. No one can know who I really am. To the world, I'll just be Aurora. Yvonne nodded, understanding without the need for detailed explanations. Aurora it is then, a new dawn. That same night, while Teresa shared the news with Mrs. Zifa, the boarding house phone rang. It was Teresa, her voice lower and more urgent than usual. Mrs. Teresa, things are getting worse here. The baby was born, a boy, but Monica and Mr. Albert fight all the time, and that Ronald is running the company into the ground with crazy investments. What kind of investments? Teresa asked, feeling a contradictory mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to completely distance herself from that world, to leave the past behind. Another part, however, felt an almost compulsive curiosity about the life she had been forced to abandon. They bought land in environmental protection areas. They're bribing inspectors to get constructions approved, contracts with corrupt politicians, inflated works. Teresa paused. And there's more. Ms. Clelia is sick. Cancer, they say. The news of her ex-mother-in-law's illness hit Teresa unexpectedly. She did not feel love for the woman who had treated her with contempt and cruelty, but she also couldn't feel satisfaction with her suffering. Life had taught her that revenge and justice rarely go hand in hand. Keep me informed, Teresa, she asked, before hanging up, and take care of yourself. In the following weeks, the partnership with Yvonne began to take concrete shape. They rented a small studio in the historic center of the city. They hired 2 young apprentices to help with production, and they worked on a special collection that would mark the official launch of the Aurora brand. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity: to unite traditional artisanal techniques with contemporary design, using sustainable materials and valuing manual work. Each piece carried not only aesthetic beauty, but a story of resilience, transformation, and hope. The launch, although discreet, attracted immediate attention. Independent fashion blogs praised the originality of the pieces. The regional magazine did a story about the artisanal phenomenon that was winning over sophisticated clients. And most importantly, sales exceeded all expectations. In just 6 months, what had started as a small studio transformed into a structured company. Teresa, now officially Aurora to the world, became a respected businesswoman, although she maintained a low profile, avoiding photographs and personal interviews. We need to expand, Yvonne announced during a meeting. There is international demand for your creations. Paris, Milan, New York, everyone wants exclusivity. The mention of major fashion centers around the world made Teresa hesitate momentarily. Expansion meant visibility, and visibility increased the risk of her past coming to light. Don't worry, Yvonne reassured, noticing her apprehension. You can stay behind the scenes. I'll be the public face when necessary. While Aurora's success grew silently, Albert's life followed a different path. The risky decisions, suggested by Ronald, began to show their consequences. Projects embargoed due to environmental irregularities, heavy fines, investigations into dubious contracts. At home, the situation was no better. The marriage to Monica, which had started as a passionate affair, had turned into a series of arguments and recriminations. The arrival of their son, instead of uniting the couple, seemed to have exacerbated their differences. "You promised we would be the most powerful couple in the city," Monica accused during a particularly heated argument. "But look at us now. We're sinking into debt, while you let that sociopath ruin everything you built." Albert ran a hand through his hair, now visibly gray, despite being only 40 years old. "Things will get better. It's just a difficult phase in the market." "A phase?" Monica laughed bitterly. "Are you blind or just stupid? Ronald is destroying the company, and you're letting him." Monica's words, although harsh, carried a truth that Albert had been trying to ignore. Ronald, the childhood friend, the trusted partner, was systematically making decisions that benefited only himself, often at the expense of the company. That same night, after another argument with Monica, Albert decided to look more closely at the recent contracts. What he discovered made him cold. Forged signatures, diversion of funds to shell companies, unsustainable financial commitments. Confronted the next morning, Ronald showed no remorse. "You were too busy with your new family to pay attention to business," he replied with a cold smile. "Someone had to take the reins. This is fraud, Ronald. You could get us both sent to prison." "Us?" "No, my friend. All the signatures on those documents are yours, some true, others, well, you understand." The implied threat was clear. If Albert reported the irregularities, he would be the main one harmed. Meanwhile, 3 years after her disappearance, Teresa was beginning a new phase in her journey. With Yvonne's financial support and the ever-growing profits of her company, she began to invest in causes that were personally significant to her. The first project was a craft school for women in vulnerable situations, victims of domestic violence, single mothers, unemployed women over 50. More than teaching techniques, the program offered a chance for a new start, for financial and emotional independence. "You're building a legacy," Mrs. Zeffa commented. Now a constant presence in Teresa's life, despite her having moved into her own apartment with a view of the sea. "I'm just giving back what I received," Teresa replied with simplicity. "When I got here, I was broken in every sense. You showed me that it was possible to rebuild, piece by piece." On a particularly significant afternoon, Teresa received an unexpected call from Teresa. "Mrs. Teresa," her voice was urgent. "Mr. Albert is on the verge of bankruptcy. Ronald disappeared from the country, taking what was left of the company's resources. And Monica is threatening to leave with the boy. The mansion is going up for auction next month." The news stirred a storm of contradictory emotions in Teresa. A part of her, small but undeniably present, felt an almost vengeful satisfaction in knowing that those who had humiliated her were now facing their own humiliations. But there was also a deeper understanding, gained through her own journey of overcoming. The true victory was not in the downfall of others, but in her own ascent. That night, after hours of reflection, Teresa made a decision that surprised even herself. She called her lawyer, a discreet professional, who handled her financial affairs and gave specific instructions. "I want to know everything about Monteiro Alves Construções. Contracts, debts, assets, legal status, everything. And I also want to participate in the auction of the mansion, but through a representative. No one can know it's me." When Yvonne questioned the decision, worried that the past could compromise everything they had built, Teresa replied with a serenity that reflected her inner transformation. "I'm not going back to the past. I'm going back to finally close a chapter. As long as that part of my story remains open, I will never be truly free. Have you ever felt that you carry an invisible weight? Something that only you perceive, but that affects every step you take. For Teresa, that weight was the unanswered questions, the unconfronted truths, the looks of pity she could never face directly. It wasn't revenge she was seeking, at least not just that. It was the chance to rewrite the ending of a story where she had been reduced to a footnote, the final confrontation. The journey back to the big city was like crossing a time portal. Every mile traveled seemed to bring with it fragments of memories. The bitter taste of humiliation, the coldness of rejection, the paralyzing fear of having nowhere to go. But now, those memories no longer had the power to destabilize her. The hotel she chose was a few blocks from the construction company's headquarters. It was luxurious enough not to raise suspicions about her financial resources, but discreet enough to ensure her privacy. She registered as Aurora Santos, the successful textile businesswoman who had come to explore investment opportunities in the region. On that first night, after settling into the room, Teresa opened her laptop and reviewed once more the detailed report that her private investigator had prepared. The information was both predictable and surprising. Albert was practically bankrupt, living in a rented apartment with his mother, Ms. Clelia, whose health was rapidly deteriorating. Monica had left 2 years ago, taking their young son and a considerable settlement that Albert could barely afford. The company, once a symbol of power and success, was now an empty shell, sustained only by its past reputation and increasingly scarce contracts. The auction of the mansion, the same one from which Teresa had been expelled with just one suitcase, was scheduled for 3 days from now. The property, once the scene of lavish parties and a symbol of social status, would be sold to pay off part of the debts to banks and investors. Closing the laptop, Teresa walked to the window. The city shone in the night, apparently unchanged. The same imposing buildings, the same busy streets, the same colorful lights of the nightclubs. But she knew that beneath that familiar surface, much had changed, and the biggest change of all was within herself. Tomorrow, she whispered to her reflection in the glass, we start turning the page. The lawyer Mendonca's office was in a commercial building in the city center. He was a respected professional, known for his discretion and efficiency, exactly what Teresa needed for the final phase of her plan. The documents are ready, Mrs. Santos, he informed her, handing her a folder with carefully organized papers. With your signature, the offer for the remaining shares will be formalized. If accepted, you will have a majority control of Monteiro Alves. And what about the mansion auction? She asked, her voice betraying only a slight tremor. Everything is prepared. Our representative will be there with authorization to bid up to the amount we discussed. I must say, however, the lawyer added with a look of slight concern, that from a strictly financial point of view, these investments are questionable. The company carries substantial debts, and the property will require extensive renovations. Teresa smiled, a smile that did not reveal her deeper motives. Sometimes, Dr. Mendonca, the value of an investment cannot be measured only in financial terms. Leaving the office, Teresa felt a sudden need to see with her own eyes what had become of her past. She drove to the neighborhood where the Monteiro mansion was, slowing down as she approached. The visual impact was immediate. The garden, once impeccable, was neglected, with weeds growing among the ornamental plants. The facade, once the object of admiration and envy, showed clear signs of neglect, peeling paint, a broken window precariously protected with boards, the imposing gate now rusted on its hinges. It was a physical reflection of the decline that Albert was experiencing in all aspects of his life. The sight should have brought Teresa satisfaction. Wasn't that what a part of her had secretly desired during those first nights of despair at Mrs. Zifa's boarding house? To see those who had discarded her taste the same abandonment, the same fall? But what she felt was something unexpected. A gentle, almost compassionate melancholy, not for the man who had betrayed her, but for the wasted potential, for the dreams they had shared, and that now lay as abandoned as that garden. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" The voice startled Teresa. A middle-aged man, probably a security guard, hired to prevent invasions of the now empty property, watched her with curiosity. "Just admiring the architecture," she replied with a polite smile. "I'm in the real estate business. I've always appreciated this style." The man nodded, not recognizing her. How could he? The Teresa he possibly knew, the shy wife of Albert Montero, had disappeared years ago, replaced by this confident and elegant woman whose eyes revealed only what she allowed. "It's going up for auction in a few days," he commented. "Too bad, it was a beautiful house." "Yes," Teresa agreed, putting on her sunglasses. It was. On the morning of the auction, the main hall of the Continental Hotel was filled with potential buyers. Curious people and, of course, those who simply wanted to witness the definitive downfall of one of the city's most traditional families. The event was more than a real estate transaction. It was a social spectacle, the final chapter of a saga of rise and fall that had fueled the conversations of the local elite for months. Teresa chose a discreet place at the back of the hall. She wore an elegant gray suit, sunglasses, and a hat that partially shaded her face. Not out of fear of being recognized, her transformation was too complete for that, but to observe without being observed. Her representative, a young lawyer assistant to Mendonça, strategically positioned himself near the stage, with clear instructions memorized and a generous bidding limit established. The murmur in the hall subsided when Albert entered, accompanied by his mother. Ms. Clelia, once an imposing figure who commanded respect and fear, now looked fragile, leaning on a cane. Her face marked not only by age, but by a bitterness that not even expensive lipstick could disguise. Something in the sight of that once powerful woman, now reduced by illness and financial disgrace, touched Teresa in an unexpected way. For a brief moment, she almost gave up on everything. The auction, buying the company, the carefully laid out plan to close the circle of her past. But then her eyes met Albert's, who was scanning the audience as if looking for a life raft in a stormy sea. He looked at her for an instant, a wrinkle of concentration forming between his eyebrows. There was a vague recognition there, as if some part of him could feel the presence of someone he had once known intimately. The moment passed, and Albert looked away, apparently dismissing the sensation as mere imagination. But for Teresa, that brief eye contact was enough to rekindle her determination. It wasn't about revenge. It never was. Not really. It was about regaining control of her own narrative. The auction began with the usual formalities. The auctioneer, a man with a powerful voice and theatrical gestures, described the property in complimentary terms that contrasted with its current condition, set the minimum bid, and opened the offers. The first bids were timid. Despite the prestige of the address, the mansion was in questionable condition and carried the stigma of a family in disgrace. Still, the value gradually increased, until only two interested parties remained in the dispute: Teresa's representative and a hotel businessman who planned to convert the property into a luxury inn. When the final bid was announced, an expectant silence fell over the hall. The businessman hesitated, quickly consulted his advisors, and finally shook his head no. He would not increase his offer. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, banging the gavel with finality. "To the representative of buyer number 47. A murmur ran through the audience. Who would be the mysterious buyer? Why wasn't he present in person? Theories circulated, from foreign investors to Albert's rivals wanting to complete his humiliation. Teresa watched Albert sign the final documents, formalizing the transfer of the property that had once been his home. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the papers, as if he couldn't believe that he was actually giving up the house he had inherited from his father, the most tangible symbol of the family legacy. When the crowd began to disperse, Teresa took the opportunity to approach. It wasn't planned. On the contrary, her entire strategy was based on remaining in the shadows until the right moment. But something in that scene awakened an almost visceral need to make contact. "Mr. Montero," she said, her voice controlled despite the inner turmoil. "My condolences for the loss of your property." Albert looked at her, initially with the empty expression of someone who is too exhausted to register unknown faces. Then, again, that wrinkle of concentration, that look of near recognition. "Have we met?" he asked, his voice hoarse from someone who had drunk too much the night before, looking for courage to face this day. Teresa allowed herself a small smile. "You could say so, in another life." Before he could fully process the answer, she walked away, blending into the crowd and disappearing through a side door. Back at the hotel, Teresa received confirmation of what she already knew. The mansion now belonged to her. Legally, the property was registered in the name of one of her companies, but the control was unequivocally hers. That night, while Albert was probably drowning his sorrows in some bar, trying to understand how he had lost everything, Teresa opened a bottle of champagne in the hotel room, not to celebrate someone else's misfortune, but to mark a moment of transition. The past was being gradually recovered, not to be relived, but to be transformed. Tomorrow would be the next step, the meeting with the remaining shareholders of Montero Alves, where the identity of the new majority controller would finally be revealed. Tomorrow, the circle would begin to close definitively. While watching the bubbles dance in her glass, Teresa thought of everyone who had been part of her journey. Mrs. Zepha, with her simple wisdom and calloused hands. Yvonne, with her business vision and unquestionable loyalty. Teresa, maintaining the fragile thread of connection with the past through the years. And she also thought of those who, without knowing it, had been catalysts for her transformation. Albert, whose betrayal inadvertently became the impulse for her to discover her own strength. Monica, whose youth and ambition had been just instruments in a larger game. Ronald, whose manipulation had destroyed what he intended to control. And Ms. Clelia, whose hostility concealed secrets that Teresa did not yet fully understand. The path that had brought her back to this city had been long and painful. But as she watched the city lights from the hotel window, the same city that had witnessed her humiliation and would now witness her triumphant return, Teresa felt a profound certainty. No matter what happened from tomorrow on, she had already won her most important battle. The battle against despair, against self-doubt, against the temptation to allow pain to define her future. The woman who had been kicked out in the rain with just one suitcase had died that night. And from the ashes of that broken version of herself, a phoenix had risen, stronger, wiser, and finally ready to confront the past not as a victim, but as the author of her own destiny. The final twist. There are moments that define an entire life. Instances crystallized in time that divide one's existence into a before and an after. For Teresa, the morning of the meeting with the shareholders of Montero Alves was to be one of those moments. The sun had barely risen when she woke up after a night of restless sleep. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she contemplated the elegant suit she had chosen for the occasion, a navy blue set, almost the same color as the dress she had worn on that fateful night of humiliation. The choice was not accidental. Symbols have power. And Teresa knew the value of closing circles. 7 years, she whispered to herself as she pinned her platinum hair into an elegant bun. 7 years since I was kicked out in the rain. The number was not just a count of time. It carried an almost mystical weight. 7 years of pain, of rebuilding, of discovery. 7 years transforming tears into determination and humiliation into strength. The boardroom on the 10th floor of the corporate building was prepared for the meeting that would change the company's destiny. A long, dark wood table dominated the room, surrounded by empty chairs that would soon be occupied by men. And a few women, who had no idea of the storm that was about to break over their heads. Teresa arrived purposely early, choosing a strategic position at the end of the table. Not at the head, where the president traditionally sat, but close enough to observe the reactions on each face when the truth was revealed. The minority shareholders were the first to arrive, middle-aged executives who talked in low voices about the latest rumors of possible buyers for the company in crisis. None of them paid special attention to the elegant woman who discreetly consulted her tablet. When Albert finally entered the room, he seemed to have aged a decade since the auction. Deep, dark circles marked his face, his shoulders hunched under the weight of worries that seemed to have no end. His eyes quickly scanned those present, stopping for an instant on Teresa before moving on. That same flash of near recognition she had noticed before. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began with a voice that tried, without success, to project confidence. "We are here to discuss the future of Montero Alves at a critical moment in our history. And have you ever witnessed someone trying to keep up appearances when everything is already falling apart? There is something profoundly human and painfully moving in that effort to preserve dignity when everything else has already been lost. As you know," Albert continued, "we recently lost my family residence due to the financial difficulties we face. But I am confident that, with some restructurings and new investments, we can." The door opened, interrupting his speech. The lawyer Mendonça entered, nodding discreetly to Teresa before taking his place at the table. "Forgive my delay," he said, arranging papers on the table. "I believe we can proceed with the true purpose of this meeting, the formal presentation for the new majority shareholder of Montero Alves Construções." A heavy silence fell over the room. Albert visibly paled, his eyes now fixed on Teresa, as if the pieces were finally starting to fit together. "I have the honor of presenting," Mendonça continued, "Mrs. Aurora Santos, or rather," he paused, looking at Teresa, who nodded slightly, authorizing him to proceed. "Mrs. Teresa Montero." The name dropped into the room like a bomb. There were muffled gasps, incredulous looks, and a single sharp sound. Albert dropping the pen he was holding, the small metallic object clinking in the absolute silence that followed. Teresa stood up calmly, feeling a strange inner peace. This moment, so often rehearsed in her mind, had finally arrived. "Yes, it's me," she confirmed, her voice clear and firm. "For those who don't recognize me, and I understand perfectly why. I was one day the wife of Albert Montero and the daughter-in-law of Ms. Clelia. I was kicked out of my home on a rainy night with only one suitcase after being publicly humiliated." Her eyes met Albert's, who seemed unable to look away, hypnotized by this transformed version of the woman he had abandoned. "But I'm not here to talk about the past," she continued. "I'm here as the owner of 6% of the shares of this company with full powers to determine its future." The reactions varied from shock to indignation, but Teresa remained unshakable as Mendonça distributed documents proving the legal acquisition of the shares. "As a first measure," she announced, "I order the immediate removal of Albert Montero from the presidency." One of the oldest shareholders rose, red with indignation. "This is absurd, a personal revenge disguised as business." Teresa smiled, a smile that contained no joy, only determination. On the contrary, sir, it's a rescue of a company that was once a symbol of integrity before misguided decisions led it to the brink of bankruptcy. She opened a folder, revealing documents marked in red. Decisions like these, fraudulent contracts, diversion of funds, tax evasion, all with the signature of Albert or his fugitive partner, Ronald Alves. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no possible defense against such compelling evidence. My second order, Teresa continued, is that an internal investigation be opened into all the irregularities committed in the last 5 years, with full transparency for the competent authorities. You're going to destroy me, Albert murmured, finally finding his voice. Is that what you want? Complete revenge? Something in the vulnerability of that question touched Teresa more deeply than she expected. It wasn't the powerful businessman speaking. It was the broken man, finally confronting the consequences of his choices. No, Albert, she replied, her voice softening for the first time. If I wanted to destroy you, I would just have to hand these documents directly to the public prosecutor's office. What I want is justice, and justice doesn't always mean punishment. It means, above all, truth. The meeting was formally closed after the presentation of the restructuring plan that Teresa had developed with the help of Yvonne and specialized consultants. An audacious plan that completely reoriented the company's focus towards sustainable construction, using innovative technologies and materials. Ironically, many of these were based on the projects Teresa had designed years ago that were ridiculed by Albert and Ronald as silly dreams of someone who doesn't understand anything. When everyone had left, leaving only her and Albert in the now silent room, Teresa felt the weight of the years condensing into that moment. Why? He asked finally. Why come back? Why not just move on with your life? Forget all this? Teresa watched him for a long moment. The man in front of her seemed like a ghost of the person who had once loved her, not just because of his haggard appearance, but because of something deeper that was broken inside him. Because some stories need a proper ending, she replied. Because for years I lived as a ghost, with another identity, another name, hiding who I really am. I needed to reclaim my story to be able to finally turn the page. Albert absorbed this slowly, as if he understood. Then, with an unexpected movement, he knelt before her. Forgive me, he pleaded, tears finally escaping his eyes. Forgive me for everything. I need to tell you the truth. And there, in the boardroom where so many business decisions had been made, Albert revealed the secret that would forever change Teresa's understanding of her own life. She was not just the rejected ex-wife, but the unacknowledged daughter of the family patriarch, the result of an extramarital affair that Ms. Clelia knew about and tolerated only to keep up appearances and maintain control. You're my half-sister, he concluded, his voice broken with emotion. Ronald discovered old documents. He threatened to expose everything if I didn't separate from you. I gave in to blackmail, to cowardice. I chose the family's reputation over our marriage. Teresa's world seemed to slow down, as if every particle of air around her had suddenly become too dense to allow movement. Albert's words echoed in her mind, completely reorganizing her understanding not only of the past, but of her own identity. Half-sister, she repeated, her voice just a whisper. So Ms. Clelia knew the whole time. She thought it was better to keep you close as a daughter-in-law than as a stepdaughter. She feared you would discover the truth and demand part of the inheritance. A bitter laugh escaped Teresa's lips, not out of humor, but from disbelief at the cruel irony of fate. Her whole life had been built on a lie, an elaborate farce, where even her marriage had been part of a strategy to protect family secrets. For days, Teresa isolated herself in her hotel room, trying to process the revelation that transformed not only her past, but her understanding of herself. She was not just the betrayed wife. She was the denied daughter, the hidden heir, the never-acknowledged sister. When she finally emerged from her isolation, Teresa had made a decision that surprised even herself. She called a press conference and, without revealing the secret of her origins, announced a complete restructuring of the company. Montero Alves will be maintained, she declared to the cameras, but with a new mission and vision. We will transform a company that lost its way in questionable practices into a model of ethical and sustainable business. As for Albert, Teresa offered what no one expected, a chance at redemption. Not in the presidency, not in a position of power, but in a role where he could contribute with his knowledge while learning a new way of doing business. I discovered that revenge does not build, she confessed to Yvonne in a late-night call. It only perpetuates the cycle of pain. What I want to leave as a legacy is not the destruction of those who hurt me, but the construction of something better from the ruins. The auctioned mansion, a symbol of so many painful memories, was transformed into a support center for women in vulnerable situations. A space where those who, like her one day, had nowhere to go, could find not only shelter, but opportunities for a new beginning. On a particularly significant afternoon, when the center was about to be inaugurated, Teresa received an unexpected visit. Ms. Clelia, visibly frail from her illness, but with still penetrating eyes that carried the weight of decades of secrets. "Why are you doing all this?" the woman asked, leaning heavily on her cane. "After everything we did to you?" Teresa looked at the woman who, unbeknownst to her, was in fact her stepmother. She felt no hatred, no resentment, but a strange compassion. After all, Ms. Clelia had also been a victim of a system that valued appearances over truths, reputation over authenticity. "Because I discovered," Teresa replied, "that our greatest revenge against those who tried to destroy us is not to let them define who we are or what we become." That night, alone in her new apartment with a view of the sea, an element that had become essential in her life since the days at Mrs. Zepha's boarding house, Teresa reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her there. From the shy and insecure wife to the powerful businesswoman, from the publicly humiliated woman to the respected philanthropist, from the victim to the protagonist of her own story. The truth about her origins, although painful, had been the final piece of the puzzle she needed to truly move forward. Not as Teresa, the rejected wife. Not as Aurora, the mysterious artist. But as herself, in all her contradictions and complexities, scars and achievements. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Yvonne, calling to confirm her arrival the next day, to help with the final preparations for the center's inauguration. "How are you feeling?" asked her friend and partner, concern evident in her voice. Teresa smiled, watching the moon's reflection on the calm waters of the ocean. "At peace," she replied sincerely. Finally at peace. Because in the 7 years that transformed a humiliated woman into a powerful businesswoman, Teresa learned that true revenge is not about destroying, but about rebuilding. The revealed secret not only changed what she thought of the past, but opened unexpected paths to a future where justice and compassion could walk together. Teresa finally understood that she did not return just for revenge, but for something much bigger. She had discovered the truth about her origins and rewritten her own story. The rejected girl was now a powerful woman, capable of turning her pain into strength to help other women overcome their own stories of abandonment and rejection. Looking at the horizon where sky and sea merged in an indistinguishable line, Teresa felt a profound certainty. A person's value is not in what others do to them, but in what they choose to do with what they have lived. And she had chosen to transform her pain not into bitterness, but into purpose. Not into destruction, but into rebuilding.
If you had the power to walk into the same room as the people who once broke you, would you choose to prove them wrong, or would you choose to prove yourself right? The Blackwood Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, a night when the wealthy, the powerful, and the dangerously ambitious gathered under the same glittering chandeliers. The ballroom pulsed with a symphony of crystal clinks, laughter that never reached the eyes, and the low hum of deals being made in whispered tones. To the untrained observer, it was an evening of beauty, luxury, and elegance. But for one man, it was about to turn into a battlefield. Lucien Rao, CEO of Rao Global, strode into the gala as if he owned it. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a midnight black tuxedo tailored to perfection, he was the kind of man people noticed even before they knew his name. His dark hair, peppered with the faintest hint of silver at the temples, gave him the air of a man in full control, not just of his business empire, but of every room he entered. And tonight, dangling on his arm like the latest accessory, was Seraphine Vale, the woman who had replaced his wife. Seraphine was everything Lucien liked to show off: young, glamorous, and hungry for more. The floor-length emerald gown she wore shimmered with every calculated step, designed to make cameras turn and women whisper. She held her head high, her smile sharp, her hand resting possessively on Lucien's arm as if staking her claim. She knew the whole city had heard the gossip, how Lucien had left his wife after years of marriage for her. She relished it. The photographers swarmed the entrance, bulbs flashing like lightning. "Lucien, over here!" "Seraphine, give us a smile!" "Lucien, when's the wedding?" Lucien grinned for the cameras, answering with the kind of charm that had made him a corporate legend. "One day at a time," he replied smoothly, as if the question amused him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the very room he believed he controlled was about to turn against him. Across town, in a penthouse overlooking the skyline, a woman stood before a full-length mirror. She was slipping into a gown the color of a midnight sky, its hand-stitched crystals catching the light like scattered stars. Her makeup was subtle but flawless, her hair swept into a sleek updo that revealed the graceful line of her neck. Isolde Rao, Lucien's ex-wife, had not planned on coming tonight. In fact, for the past year, she had avoided every event where her ex-husband might appear. The divorce had been brutal, not just emotionally, but in the way Lucien had controlled the narrative. In the papers, on social media, in their shared circles, he had painted her as the quiet, fragile wife who couldn't keep up with his world. A sad but amicable split, he'd called it. He never mentioned the truth, the betrayals, the humiliation, the years she had sacrificed to help him build his empire. When the gala invitation had arrived, she had almost thrown it away. But her therapist's words echoed in her mind. "You can't stay in the cage, Isolde, even if the door is open and the cage is gilded." So tonight she would step out, not to reclaim Lucien, God no, but to reclaim herself. She took one last look in the mirror. Gone was the woman who had once dressed to match her husband's tastes, who had softened her opinions to keep the peace, who had faded into the background so he could shine. In her place stood someone new, someone dangerous in her calm. The chauffeur was waiting when she descended to the lobby. As the limousine glided through the city streets, she watched the lights blur by. She felt the weight of the past year, the silence of her empty apartment, the hard work of rebuilding herself, the sting of seeing Lucien parade Seraphine in the gossip columns. But tonight was not about the past. Tonight was about making sure he saw exactly what he had thrown away. Back at the gala, Lucien was working the room like a king surveying his court. Investors, socialites, and politicians leaned in as he spoke, hanging on his every word. Seraphine laughed at all the right moments, touched his arm just enough to send the message, "Key's mine." But then, like a shift in the air before a storm, the murmurs began. Heads turned toward the grand entrance. Cameras clicked, this time with a different kind of urgency. And there she was. Isolde Rao stepped into the ballroom as though she'd been born to command it. The midnight gown flowed around her like liquid night, each movement catching the light. Her eyes, cool and clear, scanned the room without flinching. The chatter faltered. People moved aside as if instinctively making a path for her. Lucien's hand froze on his champagne flute. His smile faltered. Seraphine's grip on his arm tightened. Every instinct told Isolde to look away, to pretend she hadn't noticed him. But instead, she let her gaze find his. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at him as though he were nothing more than a stranger at a party. And in that single, deliberate act, she took back all the power he had stolen from her. The man who thought he'd erased her was about to learn she was unforgettable. To understand the weight of the moment Isolde Raal walked into that ballroom, you have to know who she was before the divorce. Born Isolde Bennett in a quiet coastal town in Maine, she had grown up far from the flash and noise of big city life. Her father was a literature professor, her mother a piano teacher. Money was always tight, but the Bennett household was rich in books, music, and long walks along the cliffs. Isolde grew up believing that kindness was a currency more valuable than gold, and that hard work could build a life worth living. After graduating top of her class in high school, she earned a scholarship to Columbia University in New York City. It was there, at a networking mixer for business students, that she met Lucien Raal. He wasn't in her program, he was a rising star in the business school, but he noticed her from across the room. Tall, commanding, and already carrying himself like a man destined for power, he approached her with a confidence that was both intimidating and intoxicating. Lucien was unlike anyone she'd ever met. He spoke of plans to build a global empire as if they were already carved in stone. He took her to restaurants she'd never heard of, introduced her to people who owned penthouses overlooking Central Park, and seemed to open doors to a life she had only read about in magazines. She didn't realize it at the time, but the Lucien she fell in love with was already wearing a mask. They married 2 years after graduation. At first, it was everything she had dreamed of. A whirlwind of travel, glamorous events, and late-night brainstorming sessions over wine where they talked about building something together. Isolde gave up a job offer at a publishing house to help Lucien in his fledgling company. She wasn't just his wife, she was his sounding board, his editor for proposals, his silent partner in negotiations. She organized investor dinners, soothed ruffled egos, and even helped draft the business plan that secured his first major round of funding. But as Lucien's star rose, her role shifted. She became the face beside him in photographs, the graceful hostess in designer gowns, the woman who smoothed over his rough edges in public. The late-night talks turned into late nights at the office, without her. He stopped asking her opinion on deals, and when she tried to give it anyway, he'd smile the way you smile at a child trying to explain something complicated. She told herself it was just the pressure of building an empire. She told herself he still loved her. But then came Seraphine. The first time Isolde saw her was at a charity gala Lucien had claimed was strictly business. Seraphine was on the event's PR team, a rising star barely in her 20s, with a laugh that seemed designed to be heard across a crowded room. Isolde brushed off her intuition, telling herself she was imagining the way Seraphine's hand lingered a second too long on Lucien's arm. Months later, the truth came out. Not through confession, but through photographs. A gossip site posted images of Lucien and Seraphine in Italy, his hand on her lower back, her head tilted toward him in an intimacy that needed no caption. The humiliation was public and swift. Friends stopped calling. Mutual acquaintances whispered behind her back. And Lucien, ever the master of optics, released a statement painting their split as mutual and respectful. He told the world that Isolde had different priorities, and that they had grown apart. What he didn't say was that she had sacrificed everything for him. That she had been there in the trenches when his company was nothing but an idea and a mountain of debt. That she had walked away from her own dreams to help him realize his. After the divorce was finalized, she moved into a minimalist penthouse overlooking the city. Not because she liked the cold perfection of it, but because it was far from the world she had once inhabited. At first, the silence was suffocating. She didn't know who she was without the constant pull of Lucien's orbit. But slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild. She reconnected with old friends from college, the ones she had let drift away when she became Mrs. Raal. She began consulting for startups, using the skills she had honed in Lucien's shadow to help other entrepreneurs avoid the traps she'd once fallen into. And she started therapy. A decision that felt indulgent at first, but soon became a lifeline. Dr. Marlowe, her therapist, was the one who pushed her to reclaim parts of herself she had abandoned. "You're not just the woman he left," she said one afternoon. You are the woman who can walk into any room and make people stop talking. You've just forgotten how. So when the invitation to the Blackwood Charity Gala arrived, Isolde hesitated. It was the kind of event she had once attended automatically, a fixture on her calendar. But now it represented a battlefield. She knew Lucien would be there. She knew Seraphine would be there. And she knew the city's social elite would be watching. For a week, she debated. Part of her wanted to throw the invitation away and avoid the pain of seeing him again. But another part, the part she was learning to listen to, wanted to walk into that ballroom and prove to herself more than anyone that she was no longer the woman he had left behind. The day of the gala, she visited a designer she'd once worked with during her marriage. Together, they chose a gown unlike anything she had worn before. Dark, bold, and unapologetically stunning. She paired it with simple diamond earrings, the only piece of jewelry she had kept from her marriage. As she stood in front of the mirror that evening, she barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because she felt different. Stronger. Sharper. The limousine ride to the venue was quiet. She didn't need a date. She didn't need an entourage. She needed only herself. When she stepped out onto the red carpet, she felt the familiar assault of flashing cameras. Only this time, she didn't flinch. She held her head high, letting the light catch the crystals on her gown. She didn't smile for the photographers, didn't pose for effect. She simply walked, calm, composed, and unshakable. Inside, the air buzzed with the usual cocktail of perfume, ambition, and unspoken rivalries. And then, just as she knew it would happen, the crowd began to shift. Lucien was there, his hand on Seraphine's waist, laughing as though the world belonged to him. He didn't see her at first. But when he did, the smile faltered. His hand slipped slightly from Seraphine's side. Isolde's gaze met his across the room. And in that moment, without a single word, she let him know, "You didn't break me. You freed me." And that was the moment the balance of power shifted. The Blackwood Charity Gala was a study in opulence. It was held at the Blackwood Grand, a hotel that looked more like a palace than a place of business. The ballroom stretched across an entire floor, its ceiling painted with gold leaf constellations that seemed to glow in the warm light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved in perfect choreography, trays of champagne flutes balanced on one hand, silver platters of hors d'oeuvres on the other. The air was rich with the scent of roses and lilies, imported from Holland just for the night. A string quartet played near the marble staircase, their music weaving a delicate thread through the conversations and clinking glasses. Guests wore gowns worth more than most people's cars, and diamonds that could blind under the right light. The city's elite had turned out in full force. CEOs, politicians, old money heirs, and new money moguls, all mingling as if they belonged to the same world. For Lucien Raoul, this was familiar territory. This was his stage. His tuxedo was custom-made in Milan, his cufflinks pure platinum. He shook hands with old allies, made promises to potential investors, and flashed that carefully crafted smile that suggested generosity without weakness. Every movement, every word, was calculated for maximum effect. Seraphine Vale was equally in her element. She had chosen her gown strategically, a deep emerald that brought out the fiery undertones of her auburn hair. She laughed too loudly at Lucien's jokes, touched his arm just enough to keep the connection visible, and scanned the room for the people whose approval she craved. This was more than a night out, it was a performance. But beneath the glitter, there was tension. The kind you could feel in the way conversations faltered when certain names were mentioned, in the way some smiles didn't quite reach the eyes. Gossip had its own current here, flowing quietly between champagne sips. And tonight, a fresh wave was already building. It started as a ripple. A pair of women near the grand staircase paused mid-conversation, their eyes widening. One leaned in to whisper to the other, who gasped and turned her head toward the entrance. A man by the silent auction table followed their gaze, his expression shifting from polite boredom to something sharper. The photographers stationed near the red carpet entrance had sensed it too. Their lenses swung away from Lucien and Seraphine just as the ballroom doors opened again. Isolde Raoul stepped inside. She didn't need to announce herself. The gown she wore seemed to catch the light and hold it captive. The crystals along the bodice shimmered like constellations, the midnight fabric flowing around her in waves. Her diamond earrings caught the glow of the chandeliers with every step she took. She moved with the kind of grace that came from knowing exactly who she was and exactly how much she had overcome to stand there. Conversations stopped. People turned. Even the quartet's music seemed to fade into the background as eyes followed her. Isolde didn't rush. She let the moment breathe, allowed the stares to linger without giving them the satisfaction of reaction. Her posture was perfect, her chin lifted just enough to project confidence without arrogance. She walked past faces she recognized, some friendly, some not, and offered a polite, measured smile to each. Lucien saw her. The glass in his hand felt heavier, his grip tightening without conscious thought. His carefully maintained composure threatened to crack, though only for a second. Seraphine noticed immediately, her smile stiffening as she followed his gaze. She recognized Isolde from the photos, of course. Everyone did. But the woman standing there now was not the quiet, understated figure from the gossip columns. This was someone transformed, stronger, sharper, impossible to overlook. And Seraphine hated her instantly. Isolde's eyes met Lucien's across the room. It wasn't a glare, wasn't even a challenge. It was worse. It was indifference. The kind that says, "You're not important enough to disturb me." She looked away first, but not out of submission. She simply moved on, turning her attention to a passing waiter and accepting a glass of champagne. The whispers started in earnest now. "Is that her? She looks incredible. I thought she moved away. Didn't he leave her for the PR girl? She's here alone?" In one corner, an older couple exchanged knowing looks. In another, a young investor who had once dismissed Isolde during a meeting watched her now with a hint of regret. The ripple of attention she caused had its own momentum, and Lucien could feel control of the evening slipping from his grasp. Still, he tried to recover. "Shall we?" he murmured to Seraphine, steering her toward a group of board members. But his charm felt mechanical now, his attention divided. Every time he laughed, it was just a shade too loud, a fraction too forced. Isolde, meanwhile, navigated the room with the skill of someone who had once been the hostess, not just a guest. She greeted the charity's founder warmly, accepted compliments on her gown with a gracious nod, and engaged in small talk that revealed just enough without ever slipping into vulnerability. She was playing her own game, and she was winning. Near the bar, she ran into Marjorie Blackwood, the widow who had once co-chaired the gala with her. "Darling," Marjorie said, eyes sweeping over her, "you look magnificent. I hope you're here to make certain people remember their manners." Isolde smiled faintly. Something like that. They clinked glasses. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Lucien's voice, lower now, tighter, as he introduced Seraphine to a group who seemed far more interested in watching Isolde. She didn't need to turn around to know he was watching her. She could feel it, the way you can feel the sun on your back even through clouds. And then came the first direct approach. James Litton, a venture capitalist who had always been more interested in his own reflection than anyone else's, made his way to her side. "Isolde," he said warmly, "I hardly recognized you. New look?" She sipped her champagne unbothered. "Not new, just not hidden anymore." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, whatever it is, it's working. People can't stop staring." She let the corner of her mouth curve upward. "Good. Let them look." Across the room, Seraphine's nails dug into Lucien's arm. "Why is everyone talking to her?" she hissed under her breath. Lucien didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time in a long time, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't the center of attention anymore. And deep down, he knew. The real show had just begun. Lucien Rall had always considered himself a strategist, not just in business, but in every area of his life. To him, people were like assets, each with their own value, their own utility. He had learned early in his career that charm was just as important as capital. When he met someone new, he didn't just shake their hand. He calculated their worth, assessed how they could fit into his plans. That was how he'd first approached Isolde all those years ago. She had been more than a partner. She'd been an investment. Intelligent, poised, socially adept, she could smooth his rough edges in public, elevate his image, and handle the social intricacies he didn't have time for. For years, she played her role perfectly. But as his empire grew, so did his ego. and eventually he decided that the asset he'd once valued had reached the end of its usefulness. Enter Seraphine Vale. She was nothing like Isolde, at least on the surface. Where Isolde had been understated elegance, Seraphine was all flash and fire. She came from a modest background, clawing her way into the upper echelons of the city's PR scene. Ambition was her lifeblood, and she wore it proudly. When Lucien met her during the launch campaign for one of his company's acquisitions, she didn't defer to him like others did. She challenged him, flirted with him, and made it clear she knew exactly what she wanted: power. For Lucien, she was exciting, dangerous in a way that made him feel young again. But more importantly, she was a mirror of his own hunger. She wanted to be seen, to be envied. And in Lucien's mind, she was the perfect partner for his next phase. A phase where flash and spectacle mattered more than quiet stability. Behind closed doors, though, their relationship was far from the perfect image they presented. Seraphine had no interest in being the silent, supportive figure Isolde had been. She wanted influence, and she wanted it fast. If Lucien was the king, she demanded to be the queen. Not next year, not someday, but now. In the weeks leading up to the Blackwood Gala, they'd had more than one argument about their public image. Seraphine wanted an official announcement, an engagement, preferably, that would cement her position. Lucien, ever the tactician, preferred to let the gossip swirl without committing. "Mystery sells," he told her. "We keep them guessing. We keep the spotlight." Seraphine didn't like waiting, and she liked it even less when Lucien's attention wavered. She had noticed it in small ways: the way he sometimes went silent when her name appeared in the gossip columns without him, the way his eyes seemed distant when she spoke about her plans for the future. She knew she was still in a proving phase, and she hated it. Tonight was supposed to be a victory lap for both of them. The gala was one of the most photographed events of the year, and arriving together in full view of the press would send exactly the message she wanted. We are the power couple now. For the first hour, everything had gone according to plan. They'd posed for the cameras, worked the room, and drawn their share of admiring glances. Seraphine was basking in it, until Isolde walked in. The moment Lucien's attention shifted, Seraphine felt it like a cold draft under a closed door. His hand loosened on her waist. His expression hardened, not in anger, but in something worse: focus. She had never seen him look at another woman like that, not even at her in those early intoxicating weeks. She followed his gaze and saw her, the ex-wife. And instantly, Seraphine understood why the air had changed in the room. Isolde wasn't just beautiful tonight, she was dangerous. The kind of dangerous that didn't have to shout to be heard. The kind that could walk into a room and rearrange the social order without saying a word. Seraphine's stomach tightened. She had built her place beside Lucien on the assumption that Isolde was gone, forgotten, diminished, irrelevant. But the woman gliding through the gala now looked anything but forgotten. Lucien, meanwhile, was having a different kind of reaction. He told himself he was just surprised to see her. He told himself it was irritation. How dare she show up here in his world looking like that? But beneath the irritation, there was something he didn't want to name. It wasn't longing, exactly. It was awareness. A reminder of the nights they had once owned rooms like this together. The unspoken rhythm between them as they moved through a crowd, complementing each other effortlessly. He hadn't realized until now how much he'd taken that for granted. Seraphine sensed it all, and it lit a spark of fury in her chest. She would not be overshadowed, not by the woman who had been discarded, not by anyone. She leaned in closer to Lucien, her voice low but sharp. "Are you going to keep staring, or are we going to remind these people why we're here?" Lucien straightened, forcing his attention back to the present. "We're here for the charity, Seraphine. Let's make the rounds." But as they moved through the room, he couldn't stop himself from glancing toward Isolde, and every time he did, he caught someone else already watching her. It was infuriating. Seraphine, determined to reclaim the spotlight, turned up performance. She laughed louder, touched Lucien more often, and made a point of introducing herself to every high-profile guest they passed. But the more she tried, the more obvious it became. The conversation had shifted. People weren't asking about Lucien's latest acquisition or Seraphine's upcoming projects. They were asking, "Is that your ex-wife? When did she get back into town? She looks incredible. The cracks in their united front began to show. Lucian's responses grew curt. Seraphine's smile became tighter. They were still arm in arm, but anyone watching closely could see the tension building. Finally, near the silent auction table, Seraphine couldn't hold back. "You didn't tell me she'd be here," she said through clenched teeth. "I didn't know," Lucian replied, though the truth was he hadn't even considered the possibility. He had assumed Isolde would keep to the shadows, as she always had since the divorce. "Well, she's not in the shadows tonight," Seraphine said, her tone dripping with acid. "And if you're not careful, you're going to look like you've lost control." Lucian didn't respond right away, because deep down, a part of him wondered if she was right. And that thought, that tiny, unwelcome thought, was the first crack in the armor he had worn so confidently into the gala. What neither of them knew was that Isolde wasn't just here to be seen. She was here with a plan. The silent tension that had been building since Isolde walked into the ballroom was about to break. For nearly an hour, Lucian and Seraphine tried to reassert their dominance over the room. They smiled for cameras, exchanged air kisses with the city's power players, and kept themselves surrounded by chatter. But no matter where they stood, the magnetic pull of Isolde's presence was impossible to ignore. She was like a slow-moving comet, drawing eyes and quiet murmurs wherever she passed. Lucian's patience frayed when he noticed the chairman of the Blackwood Foundation, one of his most valuable allies, laughing with Isolde near the champagne fountain. The man wasn't just talking to her. He was leaning in, clearly captivated. Worse, Isolde looked entirely at ease, her hand lightly resting on the chairman's forearm as she spoke. That easy grace, that effortless ability to connect, it had once been one of Lucian's greatest assets, and now it was working against him. "Let's go say hello," Lucian said suddenly to Seraphine, his voice tight. Seraphine's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure that's wise?" "I'm not letting her dominate my event." He guided Seraphine across the room, their approach slow but deliberate. Heads turned as they passed, some guests subtly stepping aside to watch the impending collision. It was the kind of moment that didn't need an announcer. Everyone could feel the shift in the air. Isolde noticed them long before they reached her. She had just set her champagne flute on the edge of the fountain when Lucian's tall frame entered her periphery. Her posture remained relaxed, but she pivoted slightly, ensuring she faced them head-on. "Isolde," Lucian said, his tone a careful mix of politeness and control. "Didn't expect to see you here." She smiled lightly, the kind that could be mistaken for warmth if you didn't know better. "Why not? I was invited, same as you." Seraphine stood a half step ahead of Lucian now, her hand tightening possessively on his arm. "We were just talking about the guest list," she said sweetly, her gaze flicking over Isolde's gown. "I suppose it's nice they're including all sorts this year." The words were wrapped in honey but sharp enough to cut. A few onlookers exchanged looks, knowing a social slap when they heard one. Isolde didn't take the bait. "Yes," she replied evenly, "it's wonderful that the foundation values variety, keeps things interesting." Lucian cleared his throat as though trying to reset the tone. "You look different." "Better?" she asked, her eyebrow lifting just enough to make him hesitate. He didn't answer, not verbally anyway. The flicker in his eyes said more than words could. The chairman, sensing the undercurrent, stepped in diplomatically. "Lucian, you didn't tell me your ex-wife was such a strong supporter of the arts. She's been telling me about her recent projects. Very impressive work." Lucian blinked. "Recent projects?" Isolde's smile widened slightly. "Yes, I've been consulting for a few startups. Some of them even intersect with your industry." She let that hang in the air just long enough for the implication to sink in. Seraphine's nails dug into Lucian's sleeve. "Well," she said, voice bright but strained, "it's certainly admirable that you've kept busy." "I find it helps." Isolde replied smoothly, to focus on building rather than replacing. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the small crowd signaled the impact of the remark. Seraphine's smile faltered, and Lucian's jaw tightened. Before the moment could be salvaged, another guest, one of the gala's major donors, approached. "Isolde, I was hoping you'd be here," the woman said warmly. "Would you mind coming with me? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Isolde glanced at Lucian. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but final. She turned and walked away. the donor linking arms with her like they were old friends. The little cluster of onlookers slowly dispersed, their whispers following her departure. Lucien stood rooted for a moment, the humiliation slow burning in his chest. Seraphine leaned closer, her voice a hiss. "You let her walk away from you, in front of everyone." "This isn't over," Lucien said quietly, his eyes tracking Isolde across the room. But for tonight, at least in that moment, it was. The rest of the evening only deepened the shift. Every time Lucien tried to steer attention back to himself and Seraphine, something happened to derail it. A prominent investor would pull Isolde into a conversation. A photographer would request her photo for the event's society pages. Even the mayor's wife made a point of introducing her to the city's cultural board. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about presence. Isolde carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to prove but every intention of succeeding. By the time the auction began, it was undeniable. The night no longer belonged to Lucien and Seraphine. It belonged to the woman he'd thought was finished. And as the final gavel fell on the last auction item, Lucien realized something chilling. This wasn't a lucky coincidence. It was a calculated re-entry. And he had no idea what her endgame was. The applause from the final auction items still echoed faintly as Isolde slipped out of the main ballroom. She had smiled, shaken hands, and navigated the social currents like a seasoned diplomat, but every polished exchange had taken a toll. Now, in the quiet of the marble corridor outside the gala, she finally let her breath out. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she walked toward the powder room, the muffled music behind her fading into silence. Inside, the lighting was warm but unforgiving, casting sharp reflections in the mirrors. She stepped up to the sink, placed both hands on the cool marble countertop, and stared at her own reflection. From the outside, she was flawless, the gown perfect, the makeup untouched, the expression calm. But beneath the surface, her heart was pounding. Not because she'd seen Lucien again, not exactly. It was because standing in front of him, seeing that flicker of recognition and discomfort in his eyes, had dredged up 1,000 memories she'd worked so hard to bury. The first time they'd walked into a gala together. The way his hand had rested at the small of her back, protective and proud. The nights they'd planned the future over candlelight. And then, the betrayals, the coldness, the public humiliation. Her grip on the marble tightened. "You came here for a reason," she reminded herself. "Don't let the ghosts drag you under." The powder room door creaked open. In the mirror, Isolde saw a flash of emerald silk. Seraphine. She moved with deliberate slowness, her heels clicking like a metronome on the tile. She stopped a few feet away, leaning casually against the wall, her reflection meeting Isolde's in the mirror. "Enjoying yourself?" Seraphine asked, her tone light but edged. Isolde didn't flinch. "I am, actually. It's been a productive evening." Seraphine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Productive how? Catching up with old acquaintances? Flirting with men who used to be your circle?" Isolde turned then, facing her fully. "You seem awfully concerned for someone who supposedly replaced me." The remark hit its mark. Seraphine's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "I just think it's interesting that you'd show up here, after everything. Almost like you're trying to make a point." "Maybe I am," Isolde said quietly. "Or maybe I just wanted to see how small this world feels when you step out of it for a while." They locked eyes, the air between them charged. Then Seraphine pushed off the wall and stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the air. "Let me give you some advice," she said softly, so only Isolde could hear. "If you think you can walk back into this circle and take the spotlight, you're going to be disappointed. This isn't your stage anymore, it's mine." Isolde's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Spotlights move, Seraphine. All it takes is one stronger light." Seraphine's eyes narrowed. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind her. Isolde stood still for a moment, letting the silence return. She didn't feel shaken exactly, but the encounter had left her with a familiar ache, the same one she'd felt when she first learned of Lucien's betrayal. A reminder that no matter how composed she appeared, the scars were still there. She left the powder room, but instead of returning to the main ballroom, she took the side hallway that led to the terrace. The cool night air wrapped around her as she stepped outside. The city spread out below in a sea of glittering lights. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The years lost, the love squandered, the humiliation endured. Her chest tightened, and she pressed a hand there, grounding herself. Behind her, the terrace door opened again. Lucian, he stepped out, closing the door quietly behind him. "You've always hated these things," he said, his voice softer than it had been all night. She didn't turn. "And yet, here we are." He moved to stand beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. "You've changed," he said after a pause. "People do," she replied, "especially when they've been given a reason." Lucian exhaled, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "I didn't expect this. You like this?" "That's because you never saw me," she said, finally turning to meet his eyes. "You saw what I could do for you, not who I was." The words hung between them, heavier than the city air. Before he could respond, the terrace door opened again. Seraphine's voice cut through the tension. "Lucian, the auction results are being announced." Her eyes flicked between them, assessing. Lucian hesitated. For a brief moment, it looked like he might stay. But then he nodded, stepping away from the railing. "Enjoy your night, Isolde." She watched them leave together, the emerald gown disappearing into the glow of the ballroom. Alone again, Isolde let out a slow breath. The tremor in her hands annoyed her. She had promised herself she wouldn't let him get under her skin, and yet here she was, fighting to steady her pulse. For the first time all evening, doubt crept in. Was she really as in control as she wanted to believe? Or had she walked straight into a game he still knew how to play better than anyone? Inside the ballroom, Lucian and Seraphine moved like a united front, but behind their practiced smiles, a different conversation unfolded. "She's here for a reason," Seraphine whispered as they made their way toward the stage. "I know," Lucian said. "And you're going to find out what it is," she pressed. "I will," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Seraphine's eyes glinted. "Good, because if you don't, I will." The Blackwood Gala was winding into its later hours, but the energy in the ballroom hadn't faded. The auction winners were being congratulated. Waiters carried out silver trays of espresso and petit fours, and the string quartet transitioned into a livelier set. Isolde had returned from the terrace, her composure restored, her mind sharper than it had been all evening. The confrontation with Seraphine and the quiet, loaded exchange with Lucian had done more than stir old wounds. It had crystallized her resolve. She hadn't come to the gala just to be seen. She had come to start something. Near the far side of the ballroom, a man waved to her. Crisp navy suit, salt and pepper hair, the easy confidence of someone used to making billion-dollar decisions. Nathan Cross, CEO of Crosstech Industries. They had met 6 months earlier at a private networking dinner, long after Isolde's divorce. Nathan had been impressed by her business acumen, not realizing until later that she was the Isolde Raoul. Tonight, he was more than just a friendly acquaintance. He was a critical piece of her plan. "Isolde," he greeted warmly, taking her hand. "I didn't know you were back in the city." "Just recently," she replied. "And you?" "Busy as ever. But I've been meaning to follow up on our last conversation. The joint venture idea, have you given it more thought?" Her lips curved. "I have. In fact, I think now might be the perfect time." Nathan's eyes lit with interest. "I'll set up a meeting. We can go over the numbers, maybe next week?" "Why wait?" she said, tilting her head toward the charity's private lounge just off the ballroom. "We could talk now. A few minutes, nothing formal." He hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Lead the way." As they walked toward the lounge, Isolde felt the eyes on her. The same ripple effect she had caused earlier was happening again, only this time she wanted it. She knew exactly who was watching. Lucian. He was across the room with Seraphine, speaking to the Foundation's treasurer, but his gaze tracked Isolde and Nathan like a laser. Seraphine noticed too. Her smile stiffened. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere shifted. Gone was the hum of the ballroom. Here it was quieter, more intimate. They took seats near the window, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass. Nathan leaned forward. "I've reviewed the projections you sent me. Your concept is strong, very strong. If we partnered, Crosstech could provide the infrastructure, you'd handle the brand development." "That's exactly what I had in mind," Isolde said. "And if we moved quickly, we could secure the prime locations before anyone else even notices the opportunity." He nodded, already calculating. "It's bold. I like it." She smiled, but her mind wasn't just on business. She knew word would travel fast once the right people saw her in here with Nathan. And in their world, perception often preceded reality. If people believed she was launching something big, they would treat her as though she already had. 15 minutes later, they stepped back into the ballroom, still deep in conversation. Nathan excused himself to greet another guest, leaving Isolde to make her way toward the bar. She didn't get far before Lucian intercepted her. "Interesting choice of company," he said smoothly, falling into step beside her. "Why?" she asked without breaking stride. "Worried he might be more interesting than you?" Lucian's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "Nathan Cross isn't in your league. He's a shark. He'll use you for whatever he can get." Isolde stopped, turning to face him fully. "Funny. That's exactly what I used to think about you." His smile faltered just slightly. "This isn't a game, Isolde. It never was," she said. "You just thought you were the only one allowed to win." Before he could reply, Nathan returned, handing her a fresh glass of champagne. "Lucian," he said politely, "good to see you." Lucian's response was equally polite, but his eyes were cold. "Nathan." As Nathan moved on, Isolde looked back at Lucian. "Enjoy the rest of your night." She left him standing there, the glass in his hand untouched. Across the room, Seraphine watched the entire exchange. She crossed to Lucian, her tone sharp. "She's plotting something." Lucian didn't deny it. "I know." "Then stop her." Seraphine pressed. His gaze followed Isolde as she rejoined a small circle of guests, her laughter easy, her confidence unshaken. "Not yet," he said finally. "I want to see what she's building first." For the rest of the evening, the social tide continued to shift. Isolde was no longer just the unexpected ex-wife in the room. She was a player. Conversations hushed when she passed, not out of curiosity now, but out of calculation. By the time the gala wound down, she had spoken with 3 potential investors, secured 2 follow-up meetings, and left Lucian with more questions than answers. In the car on the way home, she allowed herself a small, private smile. Tonight had been the first move. And the best part? She knew Lucian well enough to be certain he wouldn't be able to stop himself from walking straight into the trap she was setting. The morning after the Blackwood Gala, sunlight streamed into Isolde's penthouse, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows and spilling across the minimalist furniture. She stood in her kitchen, coffee in hand, replaying every moment from the night before. Lucian's flicker of discomfort, Seraphine's barely concealed hostility, Nathan Cross's genuine interest in her proposal. The pieces were falling into place, but she knew the game had only just begun. She set her mug down and walked into her study. On the desk sat a thick, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. This wasn't a journal, it was a blueprint. Every page contained details of contacts, opportunities, and connections she had quietly nurtured over the last year. It was her war map. The gala had confirmed what she already suspected. Lucian's empire was stable on the surface, but vulnerable underneath. He had expanded too quickly, relied too heavily on public perception, and underestimated the value of relationships he'd let slip away. Relationships like the ones she still maintained. If she was going to take her place back in this world, not as someone's wife, but as a force in her own right, she needed to be undeniable. The first step was image. For years, her style had been dictated by Lucian's preferences. He liked understated elegance, muted tones, and predictable silhouettes. She had worn them without question, blending into the background of his spotlight. Now, she wanted the opposite. She called Camille, an old friend and one of the city's most sought-after stylists. By the afternoon, her living room was transformed into a private showroom. Racks of bold, tailored pieces lined the walls, sharp-shouldered blazers in jewel tones, silk blouses with dramatic drapes, evening gowns that demanded attention. "This one," Camille said, holding up a scarlet sheath dress. "No one will forget you in this." Isolde tried it on, turning in front of the mirror. The color blazed against her skin, the cut hugging every curve without crossing into vulgarity. "I like it," she said simply. From there, they rebuilt her entire wardrobe. Every piece was a statement, every accessory a weapon. When she was done, the woman in the mirror wasn't just Isolde Ral, she was someone new. Someone who could walk into any room and command it. But transformation wasn't just about clothes. She knew the real change had to come from the inside. She doubled her training sessions with her personal trainer, not for vanity, but for strength. She took voice coaching to refine her tone, learning how to make every word land with precision. She revisited her notes from years of shadowing Lucian in business meetings, sharpening her negotiation skills. And she kept building her network. In the weeks following the gala, she met with Nathan Cross twice, each time bringing more concrete details for their potential venture. She reconnected with old acquaintances who had drifted after her divorce, not with apologies but with value, introducing them to opportunities, making herself useful again. People remembered generosity. They also remembered loyalty. By the end of the month, she was no longer the topic of whispered curiosity. She was the subject of open conversation. Society columnists noted her stunning resurgence and magnetic presence. Business insiders began speculating about her next move. Lucian noticed too. 3 weeks after the gala, she received an unexpected invitation, dinner at the Metropolitan Club, hosted by the Rahl Foundation. It was the kind of event Lucian used to guard carefully, inviting only the most strategically valuable guests. The inclusion of her name was deliberate. Camille smirked when Isolde showed her the invitation. "He's rattled," she said. "He wants to remind you, and everyone else, whose table you used to sit at." "Then I suppose I'll have to remind him," Isolde replied, "that I'm perfectly capable of hosting my own table." She chose a black velvet gown for the night, its high neckline and long sleeves offset by a dramatic open back. A single sapphire pendant rested at the base of her throat, drawing the eye without screaming for attention. When she walked into the Metropolitan Club, the effect was immediate. Conversations paused, heads turned, and more than one guest rose from their seat to greet her. Lucian was already at the head table, Seraphine beside him. His eyes found her instantly, and for the briefest second, something unreadable crossed his face. Throughout the evening, Isolde moved with precision. She spoke with key donors, complimented their recent projects, and dropped subtle hints about her upcoming collaboration with Nathan Cross, just enough to pique interest without revealing details. She knew the whispers would reach Lucian before the night was over, and they did. By dessert, he was at her side, his smile pleasant but his voice low. "You're making waves." "That's the idea," she said. He studied her for a moment. "This venture with Cross, what's your angle?" She met his gaze without flinching. "You'll see." The next morning, the society pages carried photos of her at the dinner, alongside captions speculating about her mysterious business comeback. Her phone buzzed with messages from people she hadn't heard from in years, each one eager to catch up. She allowed herself a moment to savor it. This was no longer about survival. It was about dominance. And she was just getting started, because the next move would be public and impossible for Lucian or Seraphine to ignore. The invitation was embossed in silver, the kind that spoke of money without saying it out loud, the Midtown Innovators Summit and Charity Gala. It was one of the city's biggest events for the business elite, part networking, part performance, part bragging rights. Lucian Rahl was on the headline panel that year, scheduled to deliver the keynote address about the future of corporate synergy. Seraphine was set to accompany him, her gown and her presence carefully chosen to reinforce the image of a united power couple. But this year, there was an unspoken undercurrent of anticipation. Ever since the Blackwood Gala, Isolde's name had been on everyone's lips. Rumors about her new business venture swirled in hushed tones, rumors that, by design, she had neither confirmed nor denied. Now, for the first time since her marriage ended, she would be attending the same high-profile event as Lucian, not as his guest, but as an independent invitee. When she arrived, the press swarmed, not around Lucian, but around her. She wore the scarlet sheath dress Camille had saved for a night like this, paired with diamond drop earrings that caught every camera flash. "Isolde, is it true you're launching a new company?" one reporter called out. She smiled smoothly. "You'll hear all about it soon." Inside, the ballroom was a sea of designer gowns and tuxedos. The scent of orchids hung in the air, the music soft enough not to interfere with business talk. Isolde made her way through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries, planting small conversational seeds she knew would sprout into speculation by the end of the night. The keynote was scheduled just after the first course. Guests took their seats at the long banquet tables as the event host stepped up to the microphone. Please welcome to the stage, Lucien Rall. Polite applause filled the room as Lucien took the podium, his smile confident, his suit flawless. He launched into his speech, weaving corporate jargon with just enough humor to keep the audience engaged. He was in his element until he reached the section about emerging market collaborations. And that's why, he said, I believe the future lies in strategic partnerships with visionaries who... The ballroom doors opened. Isolde walked in. Not late enough to be rude, but late enough to make every head turn. She didn't hurry to her table. She moved at an unhurried pace, acknowledging a few guests as she passed, each interaction stealing another sliver of attention from Lucien. He cleared his throat, pressing on with his speech, but the energy had shifted. When she finally took her seat, at a table near the front, beside Nathan Cross, the whispers began in earnest. By the time Lucien wrapped up, the room's focus had already drifted. The applause felt polite rather than electric. The host returned to the microphone. And now a very special announcement from one of our distinguished guests, Isolde Rall. Lucien's head snapped toward the host. Seraphine's hand clenched around her champagne flute. Isolde rose gracefully, walking to the podium. She didn't need notes. Good evening, she began, her voice calm but carrying easily. I'm honored to be here among so many leaders, innovators, and changemakers. Tonight, I'm proud to share that I am launching Aurora Strategies, a consultancy dedicated to building partnerships between technology startups and global markets. Our first major collaboration will be with Crosstech Industries, led by my esteemed friend, Nathan Cross. A murmur swept the room. Nathan stood briefly, offering a nod that confirmed her words. This venture, Isolde continued, is about more than business. It's about resilience, reinvention, and the belief that the end of one chapter can be the beginning of something far greater. Her gaze drifted, just for a moment, toward Lucien. I know what it means to rebuild, she said, her tone warm but edged. And I know that when you stand in your own power, no one, not even those who once underestimated you, can take it away. The applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed. Several guests stood to shake her hand before she even left the stage. At their table, Lucien's jaw was tight. Seraphine leaned in, her voice low but venomous. She just hijacked your event. He didn't answer, because she was right. For the rest of the evening, the spotlight never left Isolde. Investors approached her with interest. Journalists begged for interviews. Even a few of Lucien's own allies drifted to her side of the room. At one point, as she was speaking with a group of venture capitalists, Lucien approached. Congratulations, he said, his smile tight. Thank you, she replied smoothly. It's just the beginning. I hope you know what you're getting into, he said quietly. She met his eyes. I know exactly what I'm getting into. Do you? Before he could answer, Nathan joined them, sliding an arm around Isolde's waist in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. We have that media interview, remember? Of course, Isolde said, letting Nathan guide her away. Lucien stood there, the room buzzing around him, the realization sinking in that this was no longer his narrative to control. And Seraphine, watching from a distance, felt the first real pang of fear. Because she could see it now, clear as day. This wasn't just a comeback. This was a takeover. 2 months after the Midtown Innovators Summit, the city's social and business landscape looked very different. Aurora Strategies had launched with a splash. Articles in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal praised the company's bold vision and rapid execution. The partnership with Crosstech was already showing results. 3 startups had signed multi-million-dollar contracts through Isolde's network. Her calendar was packed with meetings, interviews, and speaking engagements. For the first time in years, she wasn't moving in Lucien's shadow. She was creating her own. And Lucien felt it. His empire, while still formidable, had started showing cracks. 2 of his longtime investors quietly pulled funding for an expansion project, citing shifting market priorities, but Isolde knew the truth. They'd shifted toward her. Even Seraphine had begun to show signs of strain. The gossip pages hinted at tensions between them. She was photographed leaving a charity luncheon alone, her expression tight, her once flawless PR sheen slipping. The final blow came in the form of an invitation. The Global Business Excellence Awards, an international gala honoring achievements in leadership and innovation, was to be held at the Grand Regent Hotel. Isolde had been nominated for Visionary Entrepreneur of the Year, a category Lucien had once assumed was his to dominate. The night of the awards, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the world's elite. Cameras lined the entrance. Lucien arrived first with Seraphine, dressed to perfection, but walking with the stiffness of someone preparing for a fight. When Isolde's car pulled up, the flashbulbs erupted. She stepped out in a midnight blue gown with a sweeping cape that caught the light like liquid sapphire. Nathan Cross accompanied her, but the way she carried herself made it clear she was the star tonight. Inside, the seating chart placed them just 2 tables apart. The tension was thick enough to taste. Dinner passed with polite conversation and subtle glances across the room. Then, the awards began. When the Visionary Entrepreneur category was announced, the host's voice rang out, and the award goes to Isolde Raal, founder of Aurora Strategies. The applause was deafening. Isolde rose gracefully, her cape trailing behind her as she walked to the stage. She accepted the Crystal Award with a smile, then stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "This award means more to me than I can say, not just because of the recognition, but because of the journey it represents. A year ago, I was standing on the sidelines of my own life. Tonight, I stand here because I chose to take it back." She paused, scanning the room, her gaze lingering for a moment on Lucien and Seraphine. "I want to say something to anyone who's ever been told they're replaceable, or that their worth is tied to someone else's approval. You are not defined by who walks away from you. You are defined by who you choose to become after they do." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. She continued, "Sometimes the end of a story isn't a tragedy, it's the prologue to a much greater one. So to anyone standing where I once stood, wondering if you can rise again, know this: you can. And when you do, you will be stronger than they ever imagined." She ended with a simple, confident nod. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her business success, it was for the strength she embodied. As she returned to her seat, Lucien's expression was unreadable. Seraphine's was not. Her tightly pressed lips told the whole story. Later that evening, as the crowd mingled, Lucien approached her. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Thank you," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze evenly. "You did, and that was your mistake, not mine." For a moment, something like regret flickered in his eyes. But Isolde had no interest in deciphering it. She had her future to focus on, and it didn't include him. Nathan joined her then, offering her a glass of champagne. "To new beginnings," he said. She clinked her glass against his. "And to never letting anyone else write our endings." As the night wore on, the ballroom's attention remained on her. People wanted to speak with her, to be associated with her, to hear her story. She had become exactly what she'd promised herself she would be, undeniable. And somewhere in the corner, Lucien and Seraphine stood together, looking out over a room that was no longer theirs to command. By the time she left the Grand Regent, award in hand, the cool night air felt different, brighter, freer. The city stretched out before her, full of possibilities she'd once thought were lost. She didn't look back, because the truth was, she wasn't returning to anything. She was moving forward, and the world was finally moving with her. So the story has ended, my wonderful friends. Are you still here with me until now? If you are, then I know something in this journey has touched your heart in a way only you can understand. Maybe you saw yourself in Isolde's quiet pain, in the way she had to pick herself up when life felt like it had been shattered. Or maybe you felt the power of her transformation. The moment she realized she didn't have to stay where she was broken, that she could walk forward and build something greater. Life has a way of testing us, sometimes in cruel and unexpected ways. People we trust may turn away. Doors we thought were open forever may slam shut. But as the old heterodox saying goes, the wound is where the light enters you. What breaks you can also be the very thing that shows you your strength. Isolde's story reminds us that revenge isn't always about hurting someone back. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away. It's about walking into a room without fear, not because you've forgotten the pain, but because you've outgrown it. And maybe, just maybe, your greatest victory will be when you no longer need their approval, their apology, or their permission to live fully. So if you're standing at the edge of your own ending, remember, this might not be the end at all. This could be the start of your greatest chapter. Stand tall, speak your truth, wear the colors that make you feel alive. Build something so strong that even the people who doubted you have no choice but to see. If this story stirred something inside you, if it reminded you of your own resilience, then please, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that might just be the spark you need. And tell me in the comments, what was your turning point moment? I read every single one, and your words matter here.